The busy morning at Atlanta International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates. Among them was Dr. Michelle Carter, her elegant black blazer and comfortable slacks, a stark contrast to the casual outfits around her. She walked with quiet confidence, pulling her small carry-on suitcase while balancing her designer laptop bag on her shoulder. At 38 years old, Dr. Carter had grown used to the surprised looks she often received when introducing herself as one of Johns Hopkins Hospital's top neurosurgeons. Today was no different as she made her way to Gate B7, where her flight to Chicago was preparing to board. The medical conference where she would be presenting her groundbreaking research couldn't have come at a better time. She had just completed a series of successful surgeries using her innovative technique. As she approached the gate, she noticed several eyes following her movement. A group of businessmen in pressed suits glanced up from their phones, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else she had learned to recognize over the years. Dr. Carter had long ago mastered the art of ignoring such looks, keeping her head high and her mind focused on the important things in life, like saving lives. Now boarding our first-class passengers for Flight AA 285 to Chicago O'Hare, the gate agent announced over the speaker. Dr. Carter gathered her belongings and moved toward the priority line. She didn't usually splurge on first class. The hospital had insisted on upgrading her ticket for this trip. "You deserve it, Michelle," her department head had said. "After that miracle you pulled off last week with the Thompson twins, it's the least we can do." At the counter, the young gate agent, Kevin, smiled warmly as he scanned her boarding pass. "Have a pleasant flight, Dr. Carter," he said, reading her title from the ticket. His genuine friendliness was refreshing, and she returned his smile with one of her own. Walking down the jet bridge, Dr. Carter mentally reviewed her presentation for the conference. Her research on minimally invasive brain surgery techniques had taken nearly 5 years to perfect, but the results were remarkable. She had reduced recovery times by 40% and improved success rates significantly. The medical community was finally starting to take notice. As she entered the aircraft, the first flight attendant, a young man named James, greeted her warmly. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. First class is to your left." However, the second flight attendant, whose name tag reads Sarah Miller, barely acknowledged her presence, continuing to organize something in the galley while Dr. Carter passed by. Finding her seat, too wet, Dr. Carter stored her carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled into the comfortable window seat. She pulled out her tablet, opening the presentation she'd been fine-tuning for weeks. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the device's screen. Other first-class passengers began boarding, most of them middle-aged men in business attire. One elderly couple took their seats across the aisle, the husband helping his wife store their bags before sitting down. They smiled kindly at Dr. Carter, and she nodded back politely. As she reviewed her slides, Dr. Carter noticed flight attendant Sarah Miller watching her with an odd expression. The attendant seemed to be doing a double take between her seat number and her appearance, but Dr. Carter was used to such behavior. She had faced similar situations throughout her career, in medical school, during her residency, and even now as an accomplished surgeon. The cabin slowly filled with the usual pre-flight sounds. The rustle of bags being stored, passengers talking in hushed voices, and the occasional announcement from the cockpit. Dr. Carter pulled out her phone to send one last text to her assistant, Janet, confirming that all her patients were stable and in good hands. "Can I get you a pre-flight beverage, ma'am?" James asked, stopping by her seat with a genuine smile. "Just water, please," Dr. Carter replied, returning to her work. She had an important week ahead. First the conference presentation, then 2 scheduled surgeries back in Baltimore. She needed to stay focused and hydrated. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, her peaceful morning flight would turn into something entirely unexpected. As the last passengers boarded and the cabin crew prepared for departure, Sarah Miller kept glancing in her direction, a look of determination slowly forming on her face. The stage was being set for what would become a viral moment in the ongoing conversation about prejudice and assumptions in modern America. As the last few passengers found their seats, Sarah Miller strode purposefully toward Dr. Carter's seat in first class. Her heels clicked against the carpet, and her pressed blue uniform seemed extra stiff today, matching her rigid expression. The flight was almost ready for takeoff, but something had been bothering Sarah since she first saw Dr. Carter board the plane. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of authority that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones and magazines. "I need to check your boarding pass." Dr. Carter looked up from her tablet, where she had been reviewing complex brain scans for her upcoming presentation. She had dealt with situations like this before, but it never got easier. Calmly, she reached for her boarding pass in the seat pocket. "Here you are," Dr. Carter said quietly, handing over the document. She noticed how the elderly couple across the aisle had stopped their conversation to watch what was happening. Sarah studied the boarding pass with exaggerated care, flipping it over several times as if searching for something wrong. "This shows seat 2A, she said, her tone suggesting she had found a problem where there wasn't one. "Yes, that's correct. This is seat 2A, Dr. Carter replied, maintaining her professional composure. Years of performing complicated surgeries under pressure had taught her how to stay calm in uncomfortable situations. "Are you sure you didn't get confused with economy class?" Sarah pressed on, raising her voice slightly. "First-class passengers usually." She let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear to everyone within earshot. By now, most of the first-class cabin had turned their attention to the scene unfolding. James, the other flight attendant, watched from the galley with growing concern on his face. He started to move forward, but seemed unsure whether to intervene. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Dr. Carter stated firmly, pulling out her ID and frequent flyer card. "I'm Dr. Michelle Carter, and I'm heading to Chicago for a medical conference where I'm the keynote speaker." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she examined the ID. "Anyone can buy a first-class ticket," she said dismissively, "but we need to ensure everyone is in their proper place for the flight's balance." A businessman 2 rows ahead turned around completely in his seat, no longer pretending not to listen. He had his phone in his hand, and the camera light was blinking red. He was recording the entire interaction. "The flight's balance?" Dr. Carter repeated, her eyebrows raising slightly. "I wasn't aware that where I sat would affect the aircraft's physics." Several passengers couldn't help but chuckle at her clever response. Sarah's face flushed red. "I'm just doing my job," she insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable." "More comfortable where, exactly?" came a new voice. The elderly woman across the aisle had decided to speak up. "This young lady showed you her ticket and ID. What more do you need?" The tension in the cabin grew thicker. James finally stepped forward, reaching for his radio to call the chief purser. Dr. Carter sat straight in her seat, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but her heart was racing. She thought about all her achievements. Graduating top of her class at Harvard Medical School, completing her residency at Mayo Clinic, becoming the youngest head of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. Yet here she was, being questioned about her right to sit in a seat she had rightfully purchased. Several phones were out now, recording the incident. Sarah seemed to notice this too, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. "I'll need to get my supervisor to verify this," she announced, as if she were handling a serious security threat rather than a respected doctor sitting in her assigned seat. "Please do," Dr. Carter replied evenly, opening her tablet again. On the screen was a medical journal featuring her latest research paper on the front cover, with her photo prominently displayed. "I'll wait right here, in seat 2A, where my ticket says I should be." The situation had reached a boiling point, and everyone could feel it. As Sarah turned on her heel to get her supervisor, no one in the cabin could have predicted how this confrontation would transform from a moment of discrimination into a powerful lesson about prejudice and presumptions in modern society. The minutes that followed felt like hours in the tense first-class cabin. Sarah returned with the chief purser, Thomas Wilson, a tall man with graying hair and 20 years of airline experience. His face showed concern as he approached Dr. Carter's seat, clearly aware that the situation had already drawn too much attention. "What seems to be the problem here?" Thomas asked, his eyes moving between Sarah and Dr. Carter. By now, at least 5 passengers had their phones out, recording everything. The videos would later go viral on social media, but for now, they captured the unfolding drama in real time. Before Sarah could speak, the elderly woman across the aisle spoke up again. "This flight attendant has been harassing this young lady about her seat since she sat down. It's absolutely shameful." Her husband nodded in agreement, his hand resting supportively on his wife's shoulder. Sarah's face reddened even more. "I was just following protocol," she defended herself, though her voice trembled slightly. When something doesn't look right. When something doesn't look right, interrupted a young man in a business suit from row 3. You mean when someone doesn't look like what you think a first-class passenger should look like? Dr. Carter remained silent, watching the scene unfold around her. She had opened her laptop now, which displayed her hospital ID badge photo as the background. The image showed her in surgical scrubs, standing proudly in front of the Johns Hopkins logo. Thomas noticed the laptop screen and did a double take. His eyes widened with sudden recognition. "Dr. Carter?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise. "Dr. Michelle Carter from Johns Hopkins." Sarah's confident demeanor began to crack. She glanced nervously between her supervisor and Dr. Carter, sensing that the situation was quickly slipping away from her control. "Yes, that's correct," Dr. Carter replied calmly, her voice steady despite the tension. "I'm headed to Chicago to deliver the keynote speech at the International Neurosurgery Conference." Thomas's face went pale. "Dr. Carter, I can't believe it's you." He turned to face the other passengers, then back to Dr. Carter. "My niece, Sophie, you operated on her last year. The tumor that everyone said was inoperable." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically. Other passengers leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear more. Even those who had been pretending not to pay attention were now openly watching. "Sophie Wilson," Dr. Carter said, her professional demeanor softening for the first time. 16 years old, right temporal lobe tumor. She's doing well, I hope." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "She just got accepted to college. You didn't just save her life, Dr. Carter. You gave her a future." Sarah stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as the reality of her actions began to sink in. The woman she had been trying to remove from first class wasn't just any passenger. She was a renowned surgeon who had saved her supervisor's niece. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding," Thomas said firmly, turning to Sarah. "Dr. Carter is not only meant to be in first class, but she's also one of the most respected surgeons in the country." The businessman who had been recording spoke up again. "I'd say there's been more than just a misunderstanding. This looks like a clear case of profiling to me." More passengers nodded in agreement. The cabin buzzed with whispered conversations and the occasional flash of phones still recording. James, the other flight attendant, had brought Dr. Carter a fresh glass of water and apologized quietly for his colleague's behavior. Sarah looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. I didn't know," she stammered, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "That's precisely the problem," Dr. Carter finally said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "You didn't know, yet you made assumptions. How many other passengers have you treated this way because they didn't fit your image of what belongs in first class?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Several passengers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps reflecting on their own biases. Thomas straightened his uniform. "Dr. Carter, on behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for this incident." "Sarah," he turned to the flight attendant, "we'll discuss this further after the flight. For now, please return to the economy cabin. James will handle first class for the remainder of the flight." As Sarah walked away, her shoulders slumped in shame. No one could have predicted how this incident would soon become a defining moment in the ongoing conversation about racial bias in America. News of what happened in first class spread quickly through the airplane. Passengers in economy class were whispering and pointing toward the front of the plane as word traveled about the famous doctor who had been discriminated against. Meanwhile, in first class, Thomas Wilson was still standing near Dr. Carter's seat, his emotions clearly visible on his face. "Would you mind if I show you something, Dr. Carter?" Thomas asked, pulling out his phone with slightly shaking hands. He quickly scrolled through his photos and found what he was looking for. "This is Sophie today." Dr. Carter looked at the photo and smiled warmly. The image showed a healthy, beaming teenage girl in a graduation gown holding an acceptance letter from Columbia University. It was hard to believe this was the same patient who had come to her with what other doctors had called a hopeless case. "She looks wonderful," Dr. Carter said, genuinely pleased. "The way her brain has healed, you can't even tell she had surgery." The elderly couple across the aisle leaned in to see the photo. "What exactly did you do for her?" the woman asked, curiosity replacing her earlier anger at Sarah's behavior. Thomas jumped in before Dr. Carter could answer. My niece had a brain tumor the size of a tennis ball, he explained, his voice filled with emotion. Every doctor we saw said it was too risky to operate. They gave her 6 months to live. He paused, wiping his eyes. Then we found Dr. Carter. Other passengers were now openly listening. James, the kind flight attendant, had stopped his pre-flight preparations to hear the story. Even the pilot, who had come out to check on the earlier commotion, stood in the doorway of the cockpit. Dr. Carter developed a new surgical technique, Thomas continued proudly, as if he were talking about a family member. She spent 16 hours in surgery with Sophie, 16 hours. And when it was over, he had to stop again, overcome with emotion. The tumor was completely removed. Dr. Carter finished quietly. Sophie was young, and her brain was resilient. She made a full recovery. A passenger from row 4, a young woman who had been quiet until now, spoke up. I read about that case in the news. They called it the miracle at Johns Hopkins. That was you? Dr. Carter nodded modestly. Every case is different, she explained. But Sophie's case helped us prove that some tumors previously thought inoperable can actually be safely removed with the right approach. The businessman who had recorded the earlier incident was busy typing on his phone. Dr. Michelle Carter, he read aloud from his Google search. Named one of Time magazine's most influential people last year, over 300 successful brain surgeries. Youngest head of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. And Sarah wanted to move her to economy class. Thomas's face darkened at the mention of Sarah's actions. I still can't believe this happened. Dr. Carter, I'm beyond embarrassed. The airline will face serious consequences for this. What I want, Dr. Carter said firmly, is not punishment, but change. This isn't about me. I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I can stand up for myself. But what about others who face similar treatment without having a medical degree to defend themselves? The cabin fell silent as her words sank in. Several passengers nodded thoughtfully. A flight attendant from economy class, who had come to see what was happening, stood frozen in the aisle, listening. You know, the elderly woman across the aisle said, my husband and I have been flying for over 40 years. The things we've seen. But until you experience it yourself or speak up when you witness it, nothing changes. The pilot, who had been listening quietly, finally stepped forward. Dr. Carter, I apologize for what happened today. With your permission, I'd like to make an announcement about this incident to the entire plane. People need to hear this story. Dr. Carter considered for a moment, then nodded. If it helps prevent this from happening to someone else, please do. As the pilot returned to the cockpit to make his announcement, Thomas looked at the viral videos already spreading across social media. In just 20 minutes, the clips had thousands of views and shares. What had started as an unfortunate display of prejudice was transforming into a powerful teaching moment that would soon reach far beyond the confines of Flight AA-285. The pilot's voice crackled through the airplane's speakers, commanding everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we take off, I want to share something important that just happened on our flight. Throughout the cabin, passengers put down their books and removed their earphones. In economy class, Sarah stood in the back galley, her face pale as she listened to the announcement. Today, we had an incident that shows we still have work to do as a society, the captain continued. One of our most distinguished passengers, Dr. Michelle Carter, the head of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, was questioned about her right to sit in first class. A collective gasp went through the economy cabin. Several passengers turned to look at Sarah, who seemed to shrink further into the galley corner. Dr. Carter is not just any doctor, the captain went on. She is the surgeon who developed a groundbreaking technique that has saved hundreds of lives. In fact, she saved our chief purser's niece when no other doctor would even attempt the surgery. In first class, Dr. Carter sat quietly, reviewing her presentation slides, trying to maintain her dignity despite being the center of attention. Thomas stood nearby, occasionally wiping tears from his eyes as he looked at Sophie's photo again. The captain's voice grew more serious. What happened today was wrong. It was based on prejudice and assumptions. As your captain, I want to be clear. This kind of behavior has no place on our aircraft or anywhere else. Suddenly, Sarah emerged from the back galley. Her hands were shaking, and tears streamed down her face. She walked slowly through economy class, past rows of staring passengers, making her way to first class. As she approached Dr. Carter's seat, James and Thomas moved to stop her, but Dr. Carter raised her hand, signaling it was okay. "Dr. Carter," Sarah's voice trembled. I saw the video of myself. I watched how I acted, how I treated you. And then I saw the news articles about you on my phone, the lives you've saved, the families you've helped." She paused, struggling to continue. The entire plane was silent, watching this moment unfold. "I've been a flight attendant for 12 years, Sarah continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I always prided myself on being professional, but today I saw myself for who I really am, the assumptions I made, the way I treated you. I'm so deeply ashamed." Dr. Carter looked at Sarah thoughtfully. "Recognizing our biases is the first step to changing them," she said gently. "What matters now is what you do with this realization." An economy passenger who had been filming the entire interaction called out, "The video of what happened earlier has already gotten 50,000 views. People are calling it first-class prejudice meets world-class doctor." Sarah's face crumpled. "My career is over," she whispered. "No," Dr. Carter said firmly, surprising everyone. "Your career isn't over. This is where it truly begins." She turned to Thomas. "I don't want her fired. Instead, I want her to be part of the solution." Thomas looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I want Sarah to work with me," Dr. Carter explained. "I give lectures about bias in healthcare and other professional settings. Her story, our story, could help others recognize their own biases." Sarah looked up, shocked. "You would do that? After how I treated you?" "Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons," Dr. Carter replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. "Take this. When you're ready, contact my office. We'll turn this incident into an opportunity for change." The other passengers began to applaud. Even some people in economy class stood up to see what was happening. The elderly couple across the aisle wiped tears from their eyes. As Sarah accepted the card with trembling hands, the captain's voice came over the speaker again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for takeoff. Today, we're not just flying to Chicago, we're witnessing how a moment of prejudice can transform into an opportunity for growth and understanding." As the plane began to taxi, Sarah returned to the economy cabin, clutching Dr. Carter's card like a lifeline. The video of their encounter continued to spread across social media, but now it would have a very different ending than anyone expected. One of redemption, forgiveness, and hope for change. The pilot's voice crackled through the airplane's speakers, commanding everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we take off, I want to share something important that just happened on our flight." Throughout the cabin, passengers put down their books and removed their earphones. In economy class, Sarah stood in the back galley, her face pale as she listened to the announcement. "Today, we had an incident that shows we still have work to do as a society," the captain continued. "One of our most distinguished passengers, Dr. Michelle Carter, the head of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, was questioned about her right to sit in first class." A collective gasp went through the economy cabin. Several passengers turned to look at Sarah, who seemed to shrink further into the galley corner. "Dr. Carter is not just any doctor," the captain went on. "She is the surgeon who developed a groundbreaking technique that has saved hundreds of lives. In fact, she saved our chief purser's niece when no other doctor would even attempt the surgery." In first class, Dr. Carter sat quietly, reviewing her presentation slides, trying to maintain her dignity despite being the center of attention. Thomas stood nearby, occasionally wiping tears from his eyes as he looked at Sophie's photo again. The captain's voice grew more serious. "What happened today was wrong. It was based on prejudice and assumptions. As your captain, I want to be clear. This kind of behavior has no place on our aircraft or anywhere else." Suddenly, Sarah emerged from the back galley. Her hands were shaking, and tears streamed down her face. She walked slowly through economy class, past rows of staring passengers, making her way to first class. As she approached Dr. Carter's seat, James and Thomas moved to stop her, but Dr. Carter raised her hand, signaling it was okay. "Dr. Carter," Sarah's voice trembled. I saw the video of myself. I watched how I acted, how I treated you. And then I saw the news articles about you on my phone, the lives you've saved, the families you've helped. She paused, struggling to continue. The entire plane was silent, watching this moment unfold. I've been a flight attendant for 12 years, Sarah continued, her voice barely a whisper. I always prided myself on being professional, but today I saw myself for who I really am. The assumptions I made, the way I treated you. I'm so deeply ashamed. Dr. Carter looked at Sarah thoughtfully. Recognizing our biases is the first step to changing them, she said gently. What matters now is what you do with this realization. An economy passenger who had been filming the entire interaction called out. The video of what happened earlier has already gotten 50,000 views. People are calling it first-class prejudice meets world-class doctor. Sarah's face crumpled. My career is over, she whispered. No, Dr. Carter said firmly, surprising everyone. Your career isn't over. This is where it truly begins. She turned to Thomas. I don't want her fired. Instead, I want her to be part of the solution. Thomas looked confused. What do you mean? I want Sarah to work with me, Dr. Carter explained. I give lectures about bias in healthcare and other professional settings. Her story, our story, could help others recognize their own biases. Sarah looked up, shocked. You would do that? After how I treated you? Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons, Dr. Carter replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. Take this. When you're ready, contact my office. We'll turn this incident into an opportunity for change. The other passengers began to applaud. Even some people in economy class stood up to see what was happening. The elderly couple across the aisle wiped tears from their eyes. As Sarah accepted the card with trembling hands, the captain's voice came over the speaker again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for takeoff. Today, we're not just flying to Chicago, we're witnessing how a moment of prejudice can transform into an opportunity for growth and understanding. As the plane began to taxi, Sarah returned to the economy cabin, clutching Dr. Carter's card like a lifeline. The video of their encounter continued to spread across social media, but now it would have a very different ending than anyone expected. One of redemption, forgiveness, and hope for change. 2 days after the flight incident, Dr. Carter stood on stage at the International Medical Conference in Chicago. The Grand Hall was packed with over 1,000 doctors, but instead of discussing brain surgery, she found herself addressing a different kind of problem. Before I begin my medical presentation, Dr. Carter said into the microphone, I want to talk about something that happened on my flight here. The room fell silent. Most people had already seen the viral video, which had now reached over 5 million views. On the conference hall's giant screens, clips from the airplane incident played. The audience watched as Sarah questioned Dr. Carter's right to sit in first class, followed by the emotional revelation about Sophie's surgery, and finally, the unexpected moment of forgiveness. In the back of the hall, a surprise guest sat quietly. It was Sarah Miller. Dr. Carter had invited her to attend the conference, all expenses paid. Sarah looked different now, dressed in casual clothes instead of her flight attendant uniform, her face showing both embarrassment and hope. What you just watched, Dr. Carter continued, isn't just about one flight attendant and one passenger. It's about the assumptions we all make every day. She paused, looking around the room. How many brilliant medical students have been discouraged because they didn't look like a doctor? How many patients have received different treatment based on how they looked? The doctors in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many nodded, recognizing similar situations from their own experiences. But this story doesn't end with that viral video, Dr. Carter announced. She gestured to the back of the room. Sarah, would you please join me on stage? The audience turned to watch as Sarah slowly made her way to the front. Some people whispered and pointed, recognizing her from the video. Her hands were shaking as she climbed the steps to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Carter said, putting a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder, this is Sarah Miller. 2 days ago, she made a mistake. Today, she's here to help us learn from it. Sarah stepped up to the microphone, her voice trembling. When I first saw Dr. Carter on the plane, I didn't see a brilliant surgeon. I didn't see someone who had saved hundreds of lives. I saw what my biases wanted me to see. She wiped tears from her eyes. I've spent the last 2 days reading about Dr. Carter's work, about the lives she's saved, about families she's helped. And I keep thinking, how many other amazing people have I judged wrongly? The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. The airline tried to fire me, Sarah continued, but Dr. Carter stepped in. Instead of ending my career, she's helping me start a new chapter. She turned to Dr. Carter with gratitude in her eyes. She's giving me a chance to help others learn from my mistake. Dr. Carter took over the microphone again. Today, I'm announcing a new program at Johns Hopkins. We're calling it Beyond First Impressions. Sarah will be one of our key speakers, sharing her story with medical staff, airline crews, and corporate teams across the country. The announcement was met with thunderous applause. Several people in the audience stood up, creating a wave of standing ovations that spread across the hall. The airline has also agreed to make changes, Dr. Carter continued once the applause died down. They're updating their training programs, reviewing their policies, and committed to creating a more inclusive environment for all passengers. In the front row, representatives from major news networks were frantically taking notes. This story had evolved from a viral video into something much more meaningful, a real movement for change. Change doesn't happen through punishment, Dr. Carter said, wrapping up this portion of her talk. It happens through understanding, education, and giving people the chance to learn and grow. As Sarah left the stage to another round of applause, Dr. Carter turned to her medical presentation. But something had shifted in the room. The doctors weren't just there to learn about brain surgery anymore. They had witnessed a powerful lesson in humanity, forgiveness, and the possibility of transformation. Outside the conference hall, social media was exploding with new videos of Dr. Carter and Sarah on stage together. The hashtag Beyond First Impressions was trending nationally as thousands of people shared their own stories of prejudice and transformation. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation on a morning flight was now sparking conversations in hospitals, airlines, and workplaces across the country. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. 3 months after the airplane incident, Sarah Miller stood nervously in front of her former colleagues at the airline's main training center. Over 200 flight attendants, pilots, and ground staff filled the room, all eyes fixed on her. This was the first official training session of the Beyond First Impressions program. Dr. Carter sat in the back of the room, giving Sarah an encouraging nod. In the past 3 months, their story had caused a ripple effect throughout the aviation industry. The video had now reached over 20 million views, and airlines worldwide were examining their training policies. "My name is Sarah Miller," she began, her voice stronger than it had been at the medical conference. "And 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed my life, and maybe can change yours too." On the screen behind her, the now famous video played. But this time, it wasn't just about that one incident. Sarah had spent weeks collecting similar stories from passengers across the country. "After my video went viral," Sarah continued, "I received thousands of messages. Some people were angry at me, but many shared their own stories of being judged, questioned, or made to feel unwelcome, not just on planes, but everywhere." In the audience, several flight attendants nodded, some wiping tears from their eyes. They had all seen similar situations, whether as observers or participants. Thomas Wilson, the chief purser from the original flight, stood up to share his part of the story. "When I recognized Dr. Carter as the surgeon who saved my niece, it hit me hard," he said. "Here was someone who had given my family a miracle, and we were questioning her right to sit in first class." Sophie, his niece, now walked onto the stage. The healthy teenager looked nothing like the sick girl Dr. Carter had operated on. She carried herself with confidence as she took the microphone. "Dr. Carter didn't just save my life," Sophie told the silent audience. "She showed me that we shouldn't let others' assumptions limit our dreams. Today, I'm pre-med at Columbia University, and yes, some people still look surprised when I say I want to be a brain surgeon." The room burst into supportive applause. Dr. Carter then joined them on stage. Over the past months, she had become a leading voice not just in medicine, but in the fight against prejudice. Major companies were calling her office daily, asking for help with their diversity training programs. "Change isn't just about big announcements and new policies," Dr. Carter explained to the audience. "It's about the small moments. It's about stopping yourself when you make assumptions. It's about speaking up when you see others being treated unfairly." Sarah revealed the new training materials she had helped develop. They included real-life scenarios, discussion points, and practical steps for recognizing and addressing bias. The airline had made these materials mandatory for all employees. But the most powerful change, Sarah said, her voice full of emotion, has been in myself. I thought losing my job would be the worst thing that could happen to me. Instead, I found a new purpose. She shared how she now worked full-time with Dr. Carter's program, traveling across the country to share their story. Other airlines had started inviting her to speak to their staff. Schools and universities were requesting presentations. A flight attendant in the audience raised her hand. "How do you deal with the shame?" she asked quietly. "I've made similar mistakes, and it's hard to face them." Sarah smiled gently. "The shame doesn't go away completely," she admitted, "but Dr. Carter taught me that shame can either paralyze us or motivate us to do better. I choose to do better." As the training session continued, news cameras captured everything. That evening, major networks would broadcast parts of the session, showing how one viral incident had grown into a national movement for change. Outside the training center, a line of people waited to attend the afternoon session. Among them were hotel staff, restaurant workers, and retail managers, all wanting to learn from Sarah and Dr. Carter's experience. "Remember," Sarah said, concluding her presentation, "every interaction is a chance to either reinforce prejudice or break it down. The choice is ours." The room erupted in applause. Dr. Carter hugged Sarah, both women knowing that their unexpected connection had created something powerful. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most meaningful changes, not just for ourselves, but for society as a whole. 1 year after the flight incident, Dr. Michelle Carter stood in front of a packed auditorium at the TED Talk stage in New York City. The red circle on the floor seemed to glow under the bright lights as she prepared to address the audience of 3,000 people. "A year ago, I boarded a plane as a neurosurgeon heading to a medical conference," she began, her voice clear and confident. "I left that plane as something more, a reminder that change can start in the most unexpected places." The giant screen behind her showed clips that had become familiar to millions. The confrontation on the plane, Sarah's transformation, the training sessions, and the movement that followed. But today, Dr. Carter was sharing new statistics that showed the real impact of their story. In the past year, over 500 companies have adopted our Beyond First Impressions training program, she announced. Complaints about discrimination on airlines have dropped by 40%, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. Sarah Miller, sitting in the front row, smiled proudly. She looked different now, confident, purposeful, and at peace with her past. Next to her sat Sophie, now in her second year of medical school, and Thomas Wilson, who had been promoted to head of customer relations for the airline. "The real change," Dr. Carter continued, "happens in small moments that never make the news." She clicked to the next slide, showing a collection of messages they had received. A young black woman who finally felt confident enough to apply for a CEO position, and got it. A flight attendant who spoke up when she saw another passenger being discriminated against. A hospital that changed its hiring practices after realizing their own biases. A school that started teaching children about assumptions and prejudice. But my favorite story, Dr. Carter said, smiling, happened just last week. She gestured to Sarah, who stood up and joined her on stage. Sarah took the microphone, her hands steady now, unlike a year ago. "Last week, I was giving a training session at a major hospital," she shared. "A young medical student came up to me afterward. She said she had been thinking of quitting because people kept questioning if she belonged there. But after hearing our story, she decided to stay. Today, she's on track to become a neurosurgeon, just like Dr. Carter." The audience applauded warmly. In the front row, Sophie wiped away tears, knowing she too had faced similar doubts. "Our story could have ended very differently," Dr. Carter continued. "It could have ended with anger, with punishment, with more division. Instead, it became about understanding, growth, and change." She clicked to another slide, showing their new initiative, a scholarship program for minority students in medical school, funded by the airline and other companies that have been inspired by their story. "Today, we're announcing that the Beyond First Impressions Scholarship will support 50 students this year," she revealed. "And Sarah will be their mentor, showing them that everyone deserves a second chance, and everyone deserves a first chance too." The audience rose in a standing ovation. In the back of the room, several airline executives watched proudly. Their company, once shamed by the viral video, had become a leader in diversity and inclusion training. But our work isn't done, Dr. Carter said as the applause died down. Every day, someone faces prejudice. Every day, someone makes assumptions about others. And every day, we have a choice: to stay silent or to speak up, to punish or to teach, to divide or to unite. Sarah stepped forward again. A year ago, I was the person making those wrong assumptions. Today, I help others recognize and change their own biases. If I can change, anyone can. As they concluded their talk, the audience rose again. But this time, something remarkable happened. People began sharing their own stories with those sitting next to them, moments when they had faced prejudice, or times they had recognized their own biases. Outside the auditorium, news crews waited to interview Dr. Carter and Sarah. Their story had become more than just a viral video or a training program. It had become a symbol of hope, showing that even the most difficult moments could lead to positive change. So what's next? A reporter asked as they left the stage. Dr. Carter and Sarah exchanged knowing smiles. Next, Dr. Carter replied, "We keep building bridges. One conversation, one person, one moment at a time, because sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest steps." And somewhere, on another flight, in another hospital, in another workplace, someone remembered their story and chose to do things differently. That's how real change happens. Not all at once, but person by person, choice by choice, day by day.